Spain is a land of contrast, and when I say contrast, I mean mountains that cut the sky, rivers that carve valleys older than memory, and coasts that have welcomed strangers for thousands of years, including traders, conquerors, dreamers, and soldiers. Long before Spain existed as a kingdom, its soil had already been walked by civilizations, each step leaving a mark and shaping the world in its own way. Here, the whispers of Phoenician merchants mingle with the echo of Roman legions. The call to prayer once drifted above cities later ruled by Christian kings. Explorers set sail to the farthest corners of the earth, bringing back riches, ideas, and stories that would change the world forever. Spain's history is not simple. It is a story of empires rising and falling, a story of faith and rebellion, a story of gold and blood. It is a story of a land that has always been at the crossroads between Europe and Africa, and it begins long before crowns, flags, or nations. Before Spain was Spain, it was a land of tribes. The Iberians along the coast, the Celts in the mountains, and the people of the rivers and plains, all building lives, crafting communities, facing winters harsher than memory and summers fiercer than today. They had no idea that one day the world would come to them. They had no idea that empires would fight over this land. They had no idea that their small hills and valleys would one day shape continents. Spain's story is not told through battles alone. It is told through cities that survived centuries, through languages that evolved, and through ideas that traveled oceans. To understand Spain is to see how a single land can carry the weight of the world. It is to understand how cultures collide, merge, and create something greater than themselves. This is a living story, the story of Spain. If this video opened your eyes to a history you never knew and you want more stories like this, please hit the subscribe button, like this video if you learned something new, and share it with someone who needs to see it, because these stories matter, and the more we share them, the more the world remembers. Long before the Romans set foot on the Iberian Peninsula, this land had a life of its own. A life shaped by mountains, rivers, and the people who called it home. Along the rocky coast, the Iberians built their villages and they were trading with the Mediterranean part of the world. They carved their homes into hills, painted symbols on walls, and worshipped gods whose names have long been forgotten, but whose influence still lingered in stone and soil. In the north and west, the Celts moved through forests and valleys, fierce and proud, their iron tools and weapons clashing against stone walls and the wild. They sang songs of ancestors, of battles won and lost, and left behind hill forts that still guard the memory of their presence. Spain was not isolated. Far across the seas, the Phoenicians arrived, drawn by the promise of trade and riches. They brought ideas, scripts, and the skill to make distant lands part of a network. They built ports, taught the locals to craft metal and dye clothes, and quietly transformed the Iberian coasts into a crossroads of commerce. Soon after, the Greeks sailed west, establishing colonies along the eastern shores. They traded olive oil, wine, and stories of gods who walked among men. And then came the Carthaginians. These people were ambitious and cunning, turning Spain into a staging ground for wars that would reach Rome itself. Spain became a land of meeting points where rivers flowed into the Mediterranean, where mountains protected valleys, and where people of different tongues and gods lived side by side, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. The Iberians traded with outsiders, yet they never lost their identity. The Celts pushed their way across hills and plains, leaving their marks in language, art, and ritual. And slowly the peninsula began to take shape as a land both divided and connected, a patchwork of cultures, languages, and traditions that would one day be tested by the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. And so we have the Romans. The first Roman soldiers crossed the Pyrenees during the Punic Wars, drawn by ambition, gold, and the desire to break the power of Carthage. They arrived to a land that was already alive and already complex. The Iberians watched while the Celts readied their weapons and the stage was set. Spain was about to be transformed forever. The first Roman soldiers arrived quietly, but their presence would echo across centuries. They came not as conquerors alone, but as builders, administrators, and colonizers. What they saw in Hispania was a land of tribes, rivers, and hills, wild yet full of promise. Rome was not patient, it was relentless. Over 2 centuries, the legions marched, fought and bled to bring the peninsula under control. Resistance was fierce. The Celtiberians in the north fought like shadows in the mountains, striking swiftly and vanishing before the Roman legions could catch them. In the south, Viriathus rose as a hero among his people, leading raids against the invaders, outsmarting generals and holding hope alive in the hearts of his people. Yet, even heroes fall, and eventually Rome would dominate. But domination was not merely about war. Rome reshaped Spain from the ground up. Roads carved through mountains, connecting distant towns. Aqueducts brought water to cities. Forums rose where once they were open fields. Cities like Tarraco, Emerita Augusta, and Cordoba became the beating heart of Hispania. Here, Roman law prevailed. Latin became the language of commerce and governance, and Spain began to feel the pulse of an empire that spanned continents. Spain was no longer just a land of tribes. It had become a province of Rome, vital, rich, and strategic. Its mines produced silver and gold, feeding the empire. Its fields grew wheat to feed legions across the Mediterranean. Its people, once scattered and fractured, now shared the same roads, the same markets, and the same laws. And yet, life was not uniform. In the streets of Cordoba, children played in the shadows of grand temples. Farmers worked in fields stretching to the horizon. Merchants shouted across marketplaces, selling olive oil, wine, and pottery to anyone who would trade. The empire brought stability, but also taxes, discipline, and the unyielding presence of Rome. It was here that Christianity first whispered its way into Spain. In quiet towns and remote villages, stories of a single God spread, offering hope and a new way of life. By the time the Roman Empire began to crumble, Spain was a land Roman in culture, Christian in faith, and Latin in tongue. Empires do not last forever, and as Rome faltered, new powers emerged from the shadows. Tribes from the north, the Visigoths, seeking their place in a land shaped by centuries of conquest and civilization. Spain had survived the Romans, but it was about to enter a new era, one of kingdoms, war, and the first steps towards the Spain we would recognize centuries later. After Rome's grandeur faded, the Iberian Peninsula seemed a land left to itself, but it was never empty. Tribes still roamed its hills and plains, and then came the Visigoths, warriors from the north, moving south into the vacuum left by collapsing legions. They did not arrive as conquerors alone. They came as rulers seeking to build a kingdom over a land steeped in Roman memory. Toledo became their capital, a city perched above the river, strong and beautiful, a symbol of authority and ambition. The Visigoths inherited Rome's roads, cities, and infrastructure, but they lacked Rome's enduring grip. Kings fought one another in endless succession. Nobles rebelled. The people accustomed to centuries of Roman rule often resisted or simply endured, caught between factions and ambitions. Yet, the Visigoths did leave a mark. They fused their Germanic customs with the Roman systems they inherited. Law, administration, and the Latin language persisted, and then slowly Christianity spread through their courts. By the late 6th century, a decisive moment came. King Gregory converted from Arianism to Catholicism, uniting his people under a single faith. For a century, this fragile unity held, but Spain's fate was not meant to rest in the hands of the Visigoths alone. Across the streets, a new force had been rising, a force that would sweep into the peninsula with speed and power, reshaping it forever. In the year 711 AD, an army crossed the waters from North Africa, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad. These forces came with determination, faith, and strategy that the Visigoths could not withstand. The narrow strait between continents became the gateway for a transformation that would last centuries. The Visigothic king, Roderick, met them in battle. The clash was fierce, but history was not on his side. Within months, most of the peninsula had fallen. The conquerors did not merely take land, they brought a new way of life. A civilization that blended scholarship, architecture, religion, and trade into something the world had rarely seen. And so, Al-Andalus was born, a land of rivers and deserts, mountains and coasts, where cultures converged in ways Spain had never known before. Muslim scholars arrived with books, ideas and instruments. Cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Granada became jewels of learning, trade, and art. Libraries housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Streets echoed with conversations in Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin. Under Al-Andalus, Spain experienced a flowering unlike any other in Europe. Science, medicine, mathematics, philosophy all thrived, while much of the continent struggled through the Dark Ages. And the influence of this era would seep into Spanish culture, architecture, and language for centuries to come. But Al-Andalus was never entirely united. Internal divisions, local kingdoms, and the persistence of Christian realms in the north set the stage for centuries of tension, conflict, and slow reconquest. The seeds of division were planted even in this golden age, and over time, it would grow into battles that would shape the destiny of Spain. Spain had been Roman, Spain had been Visigothic, and now, under the crescent moon of Al-Andalus, it was Muslim. But not only Muslim. It was a land of many voices, many faiths, and many futures, all entwined across mountains, valleys, and cities. Here, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic chapters in Spanish history, the Reconquista, a story of war, faith, and ambition that would stretch for centuries. But that is a story for the next section. For centuries, the north of Spain had remained free from Muslim rule. In the rugged mountains of Asturias and Leon, small Christian kingdoms survived, hidden in valleys, protected by cliffs, and fueled by determination. These were lands that refused to bend, lands where faith, survival, and stubborn pride became intertwined. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the struggle began. The Reconquista, which was the long reconquest, was not a single war, but a slow, patient, grinding campaign, a century-spanning effort to reclaim land, faith, and identity. Kings rose and fell, battles were won and lost, borderlines shifted like sand, sometimes retreating and sometimes advancing. Every castle, every hill, and every river became a battleground, not just for armies, but for the heart of a nation. Yet, this was not only war, it was also a story of strategy, diplomacy, and culture. Christian and Muslim leaders negotiated, married, and sometimes betrayed each other. Cities changed hands, sometimes multiple times, leaving behind architecture, art, and influence from both worlds. In the cities of the north, churches began to rise. Stone by stone, they claimed the skyline, a symbol of faith and resilience. Monasteries became centers of learning, persevering, knowledge, and training generations of leaders, scribes, and warriors. By the 13th century, the Christian kingdoms had grown stronger and more united. Castile, Aragon, and Leon began to push further south, taking strategic cities, cutting supply lines, and reclaiming towns that had once been part of Al-Andalus. The struggle was relentless, but the human spirit endured. Farmers continued to sow their fields, children played amidst walls scarred by siege, and villagers prayed for the return of their lands. Every small victory carried the weight of centuries of hope. Finally, in the south, Granada stood as the last bastion of Muslim rule. The Nasrid dynasty ruled a land of stunning palaces, lush gardens, and thriving markets, a final echo of the golden age of Al-Andalus. But even this city could not resist the tide of history. In 1942, after centuries of struggle, Granada fell. The Reconquista was complete. Spain, for the first time in centuries, was united under a single crown, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. With unity came triumph, but also darkness. The Spanish Inquisition followed swiftly, a campaign to enforce religious conformity, to remove dissent, and to ensure that Spain's newfound unity would not be fractured by difference. Jews and Muslims were forced to convert, leave, or face death. The cultural tapestry of centuries was violently altered, and a new Spain began to take shape, one defined by faith, power, and the reach of its kings. 1492 would also mark another turning point. While Granada fell, a fleet sailed west across an unknown ocean, carrying hope, ambition, and the dreams of a nation ready to conquer the world. Christopher Columbus's voyage would bring Spain not only glory and riches, but also the beginning of its age as a global empire. Spain had survived invasion, conquest, and centuries of war. It had reclaimed its land, its faith, and its identity, but it was only just beginning its rise to world power. The year is 1492. Granada has fallen and Spain is united under Ferdinand and Isabella. But while the Reconquista had closed one chapter, another was about to open, one that would take Spain far beyond its mountains and coasts into oceans unknown. Christopher Columbus, a man driven by ambition and the promise of gold, sailed west across the Atlantic. Few believed he would succeed, even fewer imagined the world he would encounter. When he landed on the islands of the Caribbean, it was the beginning of a new age, an age where Spain's reach would stretch from Europe to the Americas and eventually across the Pacific. Spain became a global empire almost overnight. Ships carried silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico, gold from distant lands, and spices from the east. Cities across the Iberian Peninsula thrived as ports, markets, and hubs of wealth. Merchants, soldiers, and missionaries left Spain to carve out colonies, bringing with them the Spanish language, Catholic faith, and a vision of a world under Spain's influence. In the Americas, Spanish conquistadors, men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, toppled civilizations, claiming lands that had existed for centuries. Temples and cities that once rang with the voices of native people now echoed with Spanish bells and prayers. Alongside conquest came the exchange of ideas, crops, and culture. The world, for the first time, was becoming truly connected, and Spain was at its center. Back in Europe, Spain's power seemed unstoppable. Kings and queens wove alliances, fought wars, and expanded influence. Art, architecture, and literature flourished. Cities became symbols of Spain's grandeur, adorned with palaces, cathedrals, and monuments celebrating victories and fates. But empire is never without cost. Wars drained treasure. The flow of silver and gold created wealth, but it also caused inflation and corruption. Rebellions simmered in colonies, plagues and famine struck home. Even the mightiest empire has weaknesses, and Spain's reach began to stretch too thin, threatening to snap. In this moment, Spain was at the height of its glory. Its sailors had crossed oceans, its armies had conquered continents, its influence could be felt in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The world was watching Spain, and Spain was shaping the world. For decades, Spain's power seemed eternal, but time, ambition, and the relentless march of history would soon challenge even this mighty empire, setting the stage for decline, upheaval, and a struggle that would echo for centuries. Spain had once ruled the seas, stretched across continents, and packed in gold from distant lands. But empires, no matter how grand, are fragile. Wealth brought power, yes, but it also brought greed, corruption, and overreach. By the 17th century, cracks appeared, wars in Europe drained treasure, rebellions simmered in colonies, and the riches of the New World, once endless, began to fade. The 18th century brought fleeting recoveries under enlightened kings, but Spain could never return to the unstoppable force it had once been. Colonies rebelled, new powers rose in Europe, and Spain found itself increasingly isolated, struggling to hold on to what it had won. The 19th century was chaos. Napoleon invaded, kings were deposed, revolutions tore across cities and villages, leaving Spain fractured and exhausted. Lost colonies, shifting borders, and internal conflict became the norm. Spain was a kingdom under siege, not from outsiders this time, but from the relentless march of change and modernity itself. And then came the 20th century, a storm unlike any before. Political divisions, economic instability, and social unrest tore the country apart. In 1936, Spain descended into civil war, a brutal struggle between republicans and nationalists. Families were divided, cities bombed, and the countryside scarred with grief. The world watched as Spain burned in conflict, and over 3 long years, hundreds of thousands perished. From the ashes rose Francisco Franco, a man who would dominate Spain for nearly 4 decades. His rule was harsh, authoritarian, and unyielding. Yet, under Franco, Spain was stable. Economically stagnant at first, isolated politically and culturally repressed, the nation endured. Streets were silent in fear, dissent crushed, but life went on. People still loved their land, their families, and their traditions. And then in 1975, Franco died. Spain woke from decades of silence. Democracy returned. Voices long suppressed now filled the streets with hope and possibility. Cities rebuilt themselves, industry modernized, and Spain began to reconnect with the world again. Today, Spain is vibrant. Its streets pulse with life, its festivals celebrate centuries of culture, and its people carry the stories of empires, invasions, and resilience in their hearts. The echoes of Romans, Visigoths, Muslim, Christian kings, explorers, and dictators are woven into every stone, every melody, every step across the land. Spain's past is not gone. It lives in the cities, the countryside, the language, and the spirit of its people. And though the world has changed, Spain endures, a nation forged through fire, faith, and the unyielding march of history. Spain today is a land of contrasts, much like it has always been. Its cities pulsed with life: Madrid, Barcelona, Seville, each carrying centuries of history in their streets, their plazas, and their people. Yet, modern Spain is not only about architecture or monuments. It is about resilience, about a nature that has endured invasions, conquest, civil war, and dictatorship, yet still rises time and again to define its own path. Walk through the neighborhoods and you can feel it, the echoes of the past mixed with the rhythm of the present, the laughter of children playing near Roman aqueducts, the smell of tapas wafting from centuries-old taverns, the music of flamenco carrying stories older than any history book. Spain is alive, a living testament to centuries of struggle, triumph, and transformation. Its people have inherited more than land or borders. They have inherited a spirit that weaves together Roman roots, Visigothic law, Muslim scholarship, Christian ambition, and the daring of explorers who sailed into the unknown. Every festival, every tradition, every song carries the weight of history, yet also celebrates life and continuity. Spain's journey reminds us of the power of adaptation. Empires rise, fall, and fade into memory, but the essence of a people endures. Spain learned to absorb cultures, survive conflict, and turn adversity into identity. Its story is proof that history is not just about rulers or battles, but about the human spirit, the countless lives that lived, loved, fought, and built the world we see today. As we look across the hills, valleys, and cities of modern Spain, we can see not only a country but a story of resilience, creativity, and endurance. A story that begins in the earliest settlement and stretches across millennia, shaping the world far beyond its borders. Spain is not just a nation, it is a living chronicle of humanity's struggles and triumphs, a land that has been conquered, rebuilt, and reimagined time and again. And in every corner, from ancient ruins to bustling markets, the past whispers, reminding us of the journey that brought it here and the promise that continues into the future. Spain endures not because of power or wealth, but because of the spirit of its people, the richness of its culture, and the lessons of history. And that is the story we have shared here today. A story of conquest, of faith, of exploration, and of resilience. A story that reminds us that history is never dead. It lives in the land, in the people, and in every heartbeat of Spain. Yeah, so that's the story. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe because I'm trying to grow this channel and I promise the history only gets better from here. Imagine watching till the end and not subscribing. Please don't be that person. Like the video, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next country. Bye!